It was a cold November morning in 2018 when 911 dispatchers in rural Earlville, Iowa, received a chilling call from a man in sheer panic. The voice on the line was Todd Mullis, a local hog farmer, who claimed he had just found his wife, Amy Mullis, unresponsive inside their red metal barn. According to Todd, Amy had been helping out with chores on the farm. When she must have suffered a terrible accident, he said she'd have fallen onto a corn rake. When first responders arrived minutes later, they found Amy lying face down on the barn floor. Her body motionless, a four-pronged corn rake still embedded in her back. At first glance, it was tragic, shocking, a freak accident. But as the small-town community began to process the news, something about the story didn't sit right. Amy was only 39 years old, healthy, active, a mother of 3, and deeply involved in her children's lives and the farm's operations. She was known for being cautious, responsible, and incredibly organized. Falling onto a tool like that seemed unthinkable to those who knew her. But the most unsettling part, according to initial statements, Todd didn't witness the accident. He said he had sent their 13-year-old son, Tristan, into the barn to check on Amy after she failed to return from a quick trip to retrieve a pet carrier. Moments later, Tristan was screaming for help. Todd rushed in, pulled the rake out of her back, loaded her into his truck, and sped toward the nearest hospital. But Amy was already gone. The ER doctors immediately noticed something unusual. Amy had 6 distinct puncture wounds in her back. The corn rake found at the scene had 4 tines. In a place where people trusted each other, where family names carried generations of pride, suspicions started to grow. As investigators began to peel back the layers of Amy Mullis's life, what they uncovered beneath the surface of her seemingly idyllic family farm was a story of isolation, control, and quiet desperation. On paper, the Mullises appeared to be living the rural American dream's successful hog farmers, raising their children on a sprawling property, hard-working, respected in their community. But as Amy's friends and relatives began to come forward, it became clear that her marriage to Todd was far from picture perfect. Amy had once been lively, energetic, and highly social, known for her quick wit and deep loyalty to her friends. But over the years, especially in the last 12 months of her life, several people noticed a shift. She had become withdrawn, reserved, almost careful. Her once regular girls' nights out had stopped. Her texting habits changed. She stopped confiding in people. Even the way she spoke about Todd had shifted from loving and supportive to hesitant and measured. It was Amy's close friend, Jennifer Simpson, who first sounded the alarm in her interview with police. She told them that, in the months leading up to her death, Amy had started expressing real fear, not of an accident, but of something far more deliberate. Amy had told her, "If something happens to me, look at Todd. I'm serious. I wouldn't just leave the kids behind." Jennifer explained that Amy had been talking about leaving Todd. The marriage had grown tense, especially after Todd discovered Amy had been texting a man she had met through mutual friends. The two had begun an emotional relationship, a connection Amy described as a safe space. Though it had reportedly not turned physical, Todd had found out, and according to Amy, he was furious, cold, unpredictable. Amy reportedly told Jennifer that Todd had warned her, "If you ever cheat on me, you better hope I never find out." Chilling words, especially in hindsight. The couple had agreed to stay together and work things out. Amy, according to Todd, had chosen the family. But those closest to her weren't so sure. Jennifer said Amy had confessed that she was still scared. She felt like she was being watched all the time. That her phone would randomly go missing and her car keys wouldn't be where she left them. Amy's co-worker at the local medical clinic where she worked part-time described a similar concern. Amy had been acting nervous the week before her death. She had asked if security cameras could pick up someone following her into the parking lot. She had asked strange questions like whether deleted text messages could ever be recovered. The day before she died, she was quiet, distracted, and when she left work early, no one realized it would be the last time they'd see her alive. The police began to look harder at Todd's version of events. According to his 911 call, Amy had gone to the red shed to get a pet carrier, while he and Tristan worked outside. But a search of Amy's phone and text history showed that she had been receiving messages. Right up until the hour she disappeared, none were answered. Todd claimed she had been dizzy, possibly lightheaded, recovering from a recent medical procedure. He suggested that she had probably fainted and fallen onto the rake. But EMTs found no signs of a medical episode, no fainting-related injuries, and no blood evidence consistent with a fall. And then there was Tristan's testimony. At first, Tristan backed up his dad's story. He said they had been working on the water lines together and that Todd had sent him to the shed. He found Amy face down. But as the investigation progressed and more interviews were conducted, inconsistencies began to emerge. In one statement, Tristan mentioned that his dad had told him to go check on Amy because she had been gone too long. In another, he stated that he had never seen his mom go to the shed at all. Investigators noticed he seemed torn, emotionally caught between loyalty to his father and the trauma of what he had witnessed. And then, in one particularly difficult interview, he said something investigators would never forget. He said to me, "Tristan told the detective, if your mom's cheating on me, she's not coming back." As the forensic team began a closer analysis of the scene, what had once been dismissed as a bizarre farm accident started to look more and more like a calculated act of violence. From the beginning, the physical evidence clashed with Todd Mullis's version of events. But now, with the full autopsy report in hand, the contradictions became impossible to ignore. Dr. Kelly Cruz, the medical examiner who performed Amy Mullis's autopsy, testified that Amy had sustained not one, not two, but 6 puncture wounds to her back. The tool that had reportedly caused the fatal injuries, a standard corn rake, had only 4 tines. Even if she had fallen backward onto it, which itself seemed implausible, it would have resulted in 4 distinct wounds. Possibly 5 if overlapping, but 6. That meant the rake had to have been used more than once. There had to have been movement, intent, force. Further examination showed that the angle of the wounds was inconsistent with a fall. Some punctures were deeper than others, and the spacing between them was irregular. One wound had torn through muscle at a downward trajectory, suggesting the rake had been thrust, not fallen upon. Amy had also sustained injuries to her hands, small but present, indicative of a struggle. Defensive wounds, and then there was the positioning of her body. First responders had found Amy face down in the shed, a few feet away from the pet carrier she had supposedly gone to retrieve. There was a trail of blood leading toward the corner of the shed and drag marks saddle, but visible, suggesting that she had either tried to crawl away or had been moved slightly after the incident. The crime scene analysts documented that the rake had been neatly embedded in her back, standing almost upright at an unnatural angle. In other words, it had been placed. None of these details supported Todd's claim of an accidental fall, and when the detectives confronted him with the inconsistencies, his reaction was ... flat. Detached. He denied any wrongdoing, insisted again that Amy had been feeling faint, and argued that she must have stumbled into the rake. When asked how she ended up with 6 wounds, his answer was chillingly vague. "I don't know, maybe she moved after she fell. Maybe it was the way she landed." But the deeper the investigation went, the more it became clear that Amy's death was not the result of a fall. It was the result of escalating tensions that had reached a boiling point. A forensic review of the family's electronic devices uncovered a series of internet searches on Todd's tablet in the months leading up to Amy's death. Phrases like "organs you can't live without," "how to make death look accidental," and "what happens if you stab someone and they live," appeared in the search history. Todd would later claim that the searches were old, taken out of context, and that the tablet was shared by multiple people on the farm. But the timestamps placed those searches in the early morning hours, when only one person was awake and online. Investigators also uncovered surveillance footage from a local hardware store taken 2 days before Amy's death. In it, Todd could be seen purchasing gloves, rope, and a brand new set of tools, including a rake that matched the one recovered from the scene. Back on the farm, cadaver dogs had returned to the shed for a secondary sweep. Near the base of the wall, hidden beneath a bale of straw, officers recovered a blood-stained glove and what appeared to be the tip of a broken rake, tine, snapped, and jagged. It matched the tool used in Amy's death. Neighbors began to talk. One mentioned that Todd had become distant in the months before Amy died, that he'd seemed agitated, short-tempered. Another recalled seeing him on the morning of Amy's death, pacing near the barn with a look that was hard to forget. And then came the most gut-wrenching discovery yet. An old voicemail left on Jennifer Simpson's phone-a-pocket dial from Amy just a week before her death. It was garbled, muffled, but in the background, her voice could be heard, shaky and urgent. "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending," she said. "If he finds out, I'm scared." Doy. The trial of Todd Mullis began nearly a year after Amy's death. But in truth, the courtroom had been preparing itself long before opening statements. The small town of Earlville, Iowa, once united by tradition and neighborly trust, had become divided. Some still clinging to the belief that Todd was a devoted husband, devastated by a tragic accident, while others had seen too many red flags to call it anything other than murder. Now 12 jurors would be asked to look beyond the barns and silos past the cornfields and community ties, and decide if a man had killed his wife using the very tools of the life they de-built together. The prosecution began by laying out a methodical case rooted in timelines, trauma, and technology. They presented the autopsy report, which revealed 6 puncture wounds, and brought in the medical examiner to explain again, in vivid, steady detail, that a fall could not have caused such injuries. She explained how the wounds were not consistent with a single accidental impact, but with forceful, repeated stabs. And then came the electronic stats search history, the purchases from the hardware store, the surveillance gaps, the rake fragments hidden beneath straw. Piece by piece, they constructed a story of a man who had become consumed by anger, humiliation, and the loss of control. Amy's affair hadn't been about lust. They argued it was about escape, about reclaiming independence. And to Todd, that was a threat. But the most emotionally devastating moment came when Tristan Mullis, then 14 years old, took the stand. Wearing a suit that looked just slightly too big for him, Tristan sat straight but visibly nervous. He recounted the day of his mother's death in slow, careful detail. He described working alongside his father, being asked to go find his mother. And the moment he saw her lying face down in the shed, his voice cracked when he said, "I thought she was sleeping, but then I saw the rake." When the prosecution asked him what his father said after the 911 call, Tristan paused. The courtroom held its breath. He just kept saying she had to be dizzy, that it was an accident. But he looked scared. It's not like scared someone's hurt, more like scared he did something wrong. The defense cross-examined Tristan gently, trying to suggest confusion that trauma can alter memories. They argued that Todd had panicked, not plotted, that Amy's injuries, while tragic, could still be the result of a horrible and unlikely accident. They painted Todd as a simple man, not capable of orchestration, but perhaps guilty of reacting poorly under stress. They even suggested that Amy's affair had caused emotional chaos for both parties, that Todd had been trying to keep the family together. And Amy, despite her journal entries and voicemails, had never officially filed for divorce. But when the defense tried to downplay the significance of Todd's internet search history, prosecution countered with expert digital analysts who explained how precise, intentional, and recent those searches were. These weren't idle clicks, the analysts testified. They were purpose-driven queries made late at night using a personal device tied only to Todd's credentials. And finally, the closing argument. The lead prosecutor walked the jury back through the entire sequence, not with dramatic gestures, but with quiet, undeniable logic. Amy Mullis did not fall. She said she was hit, multiple times. And in her last moments, she tried to crawl away. That's not an accident. It's fear. That's fight. And that's proof. The defense, in their closing, urged the jury to remember that doubt still existed, that no one saw the act occur, and that grief can make good people appear suspicious. But the evidence had become louder than the excuses. The silence in the courtroom was heavy as the jury left to deliberate. The jury deliberated for nearly 8 hours. 8 hours of weighing evidence, recalling testimony, revisiting the photographs, the diagrams of the corn rake wounds, and the silent, broken voice of a teenage boy who'd stood between two impossible truths. Outside the courthouse, reporters huddled in clusters as the sun sank behind the rows of nearby farmland. Inside, Amy's parents sat hand in hand. Her brother stared straight ahead, unblinking. No one spoke much. There was nothing left to say. When the jury filed back in, and the verdict was read guilty of first-degree murder, there was no eruption of emotion, no dramatic collapse or cries of outrage. Just the collective release of breath that had been held for nearly a year. Amy's mother closed her eyes and whispered, "She can rest now." Todd Mullis showed no emotion as the verdict was announced. His jaw tightened, but his eyes remained fixed ahead, as if rehearsing detachment. As the judge confirmed the conviction, the reality of what he had done, of what he had lost, of who he had silenced, settled over the courtroom like a heavy, unmoving fog. In the weeks that followed, the story of the Rake murder made national headlines. It was unjust the brutality of the act or the rural setting that captivated the country. It was the slow, methodical unraveling of a man's control, the forensic truth clashing with a husband's lie, the way a quiet woman's voice emerged after death. Through emails, texts, and a journal that told the story her lips never could. And perhaps most hauntingly, it was the voice of her son. Forced to relive the moment he found his mother crumpled in the barn, haunted by a father he thought he knew. At sentencing, members of Amy's family were given the opportunity to speak. Her brother, Mark, stepped forward. His voice cracked with the weight of grief as he read from a letter Amy had written years earlier, long before the affair. Before the isolation, back when she still believed in the life she was building. "I want to be a strong example to my kids," she had written. "I want them to know that love means safety. That home is not something you fear returning to." He folded the letter and looked directly at Todd. She wanted a safe place. And instead, she was hunted down in her own barn like an animal. "You didn't just kill her, Todd. You robbed your children of their mother. You destroyed your legacy." Amy's parents spoke next, describing the hole in their lives, the birthdays missed, the silence around holidays where her laughter used to live. They talked about how she always brought extra pies to family dinners, how she remembered everyone's favorite snacks, how she never forgot a birthday card. "You didn't just bury a body," her mother said. "You buried a light." When Tristan chose not to speak at sentencing, no one pressed him. He had said enough. His presence, his strength, was statement enough. One courtroom observer later wrote that the boy looked older than his years, as though he had aged decades and months. Todd was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, a strange stillness settled in the room. Justice had been done, but in a town like Earlville, where everyone knows everyone, the damage was permanent. The Mullis farm was later sold. The barn where Amy died was torn down. But what remained, what endured, was the conversation her case sparked across the country, about coercive control, about emotional abuse that hides behind closed doors, about the importance of listening to what isn't said out loud. Amy's story became more than a tragedy, became a wake-up call. And today, Amy Mullis is remembered not as the woman who fell on a corn rake, but as the woman whose truth refused to stay buried. Even after the verdict and sentencing, the echoes of Amy Mullis's story didn't fade away, they deepened. In fact, for many people in Iowa and beyond, the real story was just beginning, because the trial may have ended in a conviction, but what it exposed about control, fear, and silence inside the framework of a normal marriage became a warning far louder than any closing argument. In the months following Todd Mullis's sentencing, multiple advocacy groups, especially those focused on rural domestic violence, began citing Amy's case in training materials and outreach programs. For years, discussions about coercive control, gaslighting, and emotional isolation had largely centered around urban or suburban examples. Amy's story shattered that mold. It proved that even in the most tight-knit farming communities where everyone assumes they know what happens behind closed doors, someone can be trapped, unheard, and in danger. Her journal became a centerpiece for educational workshops across the Midwest. Short excerpts were read aloud in college classrooms, victim support meetings, and law enforcement seminars. One particular line was quoted more than any other. "He doesn't scream. He doesn't hit. I can't breathe when he's in the room." That single sentence forced people to redefine what control looks like. Tristan, meanwhile, stayed mostly out of the public eye. He moved in with extended family, and quietly continued his education. He didn't do interviews. He didn't issue statements. But according to one source close to the family, he's been working with a counselor who specializes in trauma, recovery, and complex grief. His strength during the trial had been remarkable, but it came at a cost. Few outside that courtroom could truly understand. He had seen the worst of both his parents, his mother's suffering, and his father's betrayal. Law enforcement officials involved in the case also admitted in later interviews how deeply it had affected them. One detective said, "This wasn't just about solving a murder, it was about recognizing something we almost missed." That woman was asking for help in 1,000 subtle ways. You just didn't see it until it was too late. Another officer said that after working Amy's case, he started looking differently at some of the domestic calls they responded to, calls where the victim had no bruises, no cuts, but looked hollow, unsure, overly apologetic. Even the jury foreman, who never spoke publicly during the trial, eventually gave a written statement to a local journalist. In it, he wrote, "The evidence told a story, yes, but it was Amy's voice, her journal, her texts, her voicemail that convinced us. We couldn't save her, but we could finally believe her." Several months after the trial ended, a memorial garden was established at a small community park in Amy's hometown, funded by donations from friends, neighbors, and even strangers across the country who had been touched by her story. The garden features a simple plaque that reads, "For Amy, for every voice that went unheard, we hear you now." Visitors often leave notes tucked under the edges of the bench or tied to the flowering trees. Some of them are from people who knew Amy personally. Others are from women and men who never met her, but found courage in her story, courage to leave, to speak up, to document their pain, to seek safety. Amy Mullis became more than a victim of a terrible crime. She became a symbol of what can go wrong when we ignore the quiet signs. Her legacy now stands as a lesson, one that continues to ripple far beyond the cornfields of Iowa. Thank you for watching this episode. Amy Mullis' story is one that lingers not just because of the tragic way her life ended, but because of everything it revealed. Behind the quiet routines of rural life, behind the barns and family dinners, was a woman slowly fading under pressure most of us never saw. She tried to speak. She wrote it down. She told those closest to her. And still, it wasn't enough to stop what happened. Now it's up to us, not just to remember Amy, but to listen more carefully to those around us, to trust instincts, to ask questions, and to understand that not all violence leaves bruises. Sometimes the most dangerous place is the one that feels most familiar. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video. Your engagement helps more people discover stories that matter. Leave a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts, your reflections, and your voice. Don't forget to share this episode with others and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, real-life stories that reveal the truth hidden in plain sight. And click the bell icon so you never miss what comes next. Thank you again for watching. We'll see you in the next story.